Well, congratulations. This is our final lecture talk of the course. You've suffered through a lot, and we've definitely covered a lot of ground. Now we have but one small task left: to go through almost 100 years of very eventful history. In more than a few ways, World War II was the high point and the breaking point for America and the West. On the one hand, the U.S. and Britain rose to the occasion of shaking off the Great Depression and conquering, with the aid of the Soviets, one of the most evil empires in known history. Afterward, the U.S. in particular enters a huge economic upswing that, to a certain extent, will make the Roaring Twenties seem calm and collected by comparison. And yet at the same time, philosophically, the West emerges broken and bleeding. Europe especially is suffering. They faced widespread slaughter and physical destruction in the Great War, and they've also experienced a complete loss of their high and glorious ideals and expectations. It's hard enough to face general disappointment. Imagine what it's like to find out that you really aren't the demigod you thought you were. Worse, you find out that your ideas and discoveries and technologies, far from perfecting the world, inflicted far more harm than the world had ever seen before. It's a very long way to fall, and a very rough landing at the bottom, and it's about to get worse. In the United States, the economic system worked through a process of expansions and contractions. The economy itself was largely free and limited only by the creativity and hard work of Americans themselves. So it tended to go in fits and starts. A boom would begin, people would work and invest and create new businesses, and the good times would roll for a while. But people would always get greedy, they never seemed to know where to stop, and the economy would grow very rapidly, too rapidly. Economic expansion would eventually get to the point where it was too far to be supported by the underlying fundamentals, and there would be a crash as the economy pulled itself back down into a more sustainable form. These contractions were called panics in the 1800s, depressions in the 20th century, and today they're generally called recessions. When the contraction did hit, though, it never brought the U.S. back down to its original place. It always ended up bigger than it was when the last boom started. Then the process would begin again. Also, the longer the U.S. went in a period of boom, the bigger the bust was, or the correction tended to be. That should make some sense, as the bigger the boom, the more correction that needed to happen. This boom-bust cycle had made the U.S. into an economic powerhouse over time. The Roaring Twenties were very clearly one of these boom periods of massive, virtually unrestrained economic expansion. That meant that as the U.S. approached the end of the 20s, it was increasingly due for a bust. The bust happened at the end of October 1929. There was a massive sell-off of stock, and more than a few people who woke up that morning millionaires were in the gutter by that afternoon. Remember, many of these people, like today, were millionaires in name only. They had little to no cash, and all of their money was locked up in the stock market. When the stock market blew up, that means they lost everything, and couldn't even pay their basic bills in many cases. So what? The millionaires lost their money. Boo-hoo, some might say. But think it through. Who owned the businesses you bought your daily needs from? Who made loans to the factory you worked for? And if you had taken out a loan yourself earlier, who called that loan in because they were now desperately in debt? The crisis quickly spread throughout the whole economy. Banks began closing left and right, and many people lost their entire life savings when they did. Employers made drastic cutbacks in labor, and millions were soon without jobs all over the country. This sort of thing had happened before, and it will again. Previously, though, the government would simply stand back and let the creativity of the American people solve the problem. It would hurt for a while, but they invariably figured it out, and the economy was usually back on track in a few years. But this time was different. This time we had the recent descendants of the progressives, and they planned to use the government's power and tax money to forcibly fix the problem. Unfortunately, one of the first things they did was pass a tariff, a tax on imports, that effectively spread the Depression to Europe as well. Germany's economy, already just barely hanging on, collapsed completely and many faced starvation. When the reparations payments from Germany stopped, the Depression spread to Britain and France as well. It was a very bad situation, and it would last for all of the 1930s. As people suffered, especially the Germans who thought they saw no way forward within the bounds of the Treaty of Versailles, people were increasingly ready to do something radical. This set the stage for Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Workers' Party, or Nazis for short. Hitler was an Austrian and a struggling artist in Vienna when World War I began. He had swallowed the idea of German nationalism whole, and he had absorbed much of the German Darwinist racial thinking that was popular in the universities and beer houses at the time. He joined the war and served honorably. He was temporarily blinded in a gas attack and still recovering when he heard about Germany's surrender. At that moment, he swore he would return Germany to greatness. Hitler's definition of greatness was based largely on his understanding of the logical consequences of Spencer's survival of the fittest and Nietzsche's will to power. Germans represented the highest form of human evolution and were destined to lead and dominate first Europe and then the larger world. He saw it as his role to be the savior to the German people and then later to all of humanity, taking control of evolution and political systems and using them to create a perfect Nazified world. Creating a perfect world. Does that general goal sound familiar at all? Hitler's first attempt to seize power didn't go well. He was arrested and imprisoned after the infamous Beer Hall Putsch in 1923. He was still immensely influential, though, and he spent a cushy 9 months in prison surrounded by his cronies plotting his return. Part of that was writing what he hoped would be his magnum opus, Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf means my struggle, though the original title was much more colorful. 4.5 years of struggle against lies, stupidity, and cowardice. Sounds like a book you want to pick up, right? The book was part self-praising autobiography and part political manifesto. In it, Hitler laid out his whole worldview at the time and his plan for the grand remaking of Germany and Europe. Overall, it's a rambling, self-absorbed book that leaves you scratching your head as to how anyone could get really excited about it. But somehow, they did. The book became a bestseller and it revolutionized the Nazi Party in Germany. By the end of the decade, it had become required study for all German students, and people were quoting it word for word like scripture. In a nutshell, Hitler argued for the innate superiority of Germans and against the shameful way they had been treated after the late war. Perhaps if we would stop there, you might be able to understand why it was so popular. Everyone likes to hear they're better than everyone else, and the simple hard fact was that Germany had been treated poorly in the Treaty of Versailles. While we always like to think of Hitler as a complete and total liar, the fact is that no really good lie is completely devoid of truth. If it was, no one would believe it. The best lies have enough truth in them to make them believable, and so it was with Hitler's. More specifically, Hitler, along his rambling way, emphasized 3 things. First, he blamed all of Germany's ills on the Jews. Indeed, he regarded the Jews as the absolute worst trash in the human gene pool and a positive threat to humanity. In doing so, he gave the German people a target for their anger, someone to blame. Next, his entire system unfolded directly from his understanding of Darwin, or German philosophers' understanding of Darwin. Some human races were more evolved than others, and that was the filter through which every piece of information passed. That made it racist top to bottom. Note, too, that there is nothing inconsistent with that view in Darwinism, especially Herbert Spencer's social Darwinism. Survival of the fittest. In fact, if you believe in atheistic Darwinism, it's hard not to draw that conclusion eventually. Finally, Hitler wanted to unite all German-speaking people and give them what he called Lebensraum, or living space. By that, he meant that Germany should expand until it had enough territory to sustain itself without having to depend on anyone else. People may not have believed that he would do the things he wrote about, but if you read Mein Kampf, nothing that Hitler did later should have been a surprise. In fact, it was a direct blueprint for the general path that he followed straight into World War II. Reading Mein Kampf is a study in an evil mind. Don't be shocked if at times you might find some of his ideas attractive or even somewhat convincing, because real evil presents itself as something people want to believe. So steel yourself and stay focused. Also, please take it seriously. In the last 10 years, it has landed on the bestseller list in more than a few countries. And it's not just open neo-Nazis who are finding it again. Its popularity in radical Islamic and hard-left audiences is growing again too. It's a frightening world we live in, and it's best we were armed for it. Which brings us careening against virtually everyone's will straight into World War II. If World War I was the glorious war that everyone seemed to want and no one expected would actually happen, World War II was just the opposite. Everyone seemed to know that war was coming, but no one wanted it. Even Hitler, who expected to go to war eventually, did not want the war to start when it did. With the benefit of hindsight, we can say that it really began back in 1937 with Japan's invasion of China, but it came to Europe later in fits and starts. Hitler took advantage of everyone's desire to avoid war and of that assumption that humans were inherently good to present himself to Europe as a reasonable person, just looking out for the good of his people. Using that approach, he remilitarized the Rhineland and rebuilt the German army in blatant violation of the Treaty of Versailles, forced a generally peaceful takeover of Austria, occupied the Sudetenland, and then took the rest of Czechoslovakia for good measure. Each time he did something, the British and French negotiated away what he wanted in the pitiful hope of keeping the peace. This just made Hitler more greedy than ever, and in 1939 he struck a deal with Stalin and the Soviets, and that September they cut Poland up between them. Britain and France finally drew a line then, but Hitler smashed France and nearly captured the whole British army in response. He then began to prepare for an invasion of Britain with an air campaign that would come to be called the Battle of Britain. The U.S. was once again ready to stay out of it, but this time it was clear to U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt that it was only a matter of time until the U.S. got involved. In fact, unlike last time when the Germans were just one more combatant in a senseless war, the idea of a Nazi-dominated Europe was unacceptable. The U.S. was brought into it by a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, December 7th. The U.S. had refused to sell oil to the Japanese unless they pulled back out of China. Japan crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet and then rapidly took over large portions of the Pacific while the U.S. recovered. Japan had a mutual defense treaty with Germany, and so when the U.S. declared war on Japan, Germany was forced to declare war on the U.S., who then returned the favor. Now, covering all of World War II is, of course, far too big a topic, but the takeaway for our purposes is that it was hugely destructive over massive portions of the globe in terms of material loss and loss of life. Another whole generation of Americans and Europeans faced major trauma, if they made it back home at all. In addition to the physical cost of the war, it was psychologically and philosophically devastating. For the time being, at least, all of the romantic, Enlightenment, progressive nonsense about humans being inherently good and science creating a perfect world were exposed for the complete lies that they were. The world, in fact, had not gotten any better. 2 world wars had wiped out millions of people as proof of that. Further, all of the wonderful things that science had done seemed completely outweighed by its evils. Far from curing all disease and ending poverty, science had turned humans into expert-killing machines, and they were only getting better. It had even ended the war with a nuclear bomb, a technology that could wipe out virtually the entire world as it developed in just a few years. All of this left everyone, Americans, Europeans, Asians, all alike, with a very deep-seated distrust of all of the promises that had come before. Worse, progressivism and science had been all about making these promises in the name of objective truth. Science would not find just answers to everything, but the right answers to everything. Answers that no one could argue with, the truth. That complete sense of absolute certainty rang hollow now, and many philosophers, authors, and culture makers came to reject the whole idea of truth itself. But more on that in a bit. Remember when we said that it often takes decades to produce connected consequences to certain ideas? Well, some of those consequences really hit the fan hard in World War II. When they did, it was another crushing blow to all of that secular idealism we've been talking about. As the armies rolled over the continent, the public found out about Hitler's Holocaust. As part and parcel of his plan to save the world, Hitler intended to exterminate the bits of humanity that he saw as holding it back from evolutionary glory. In doing so, he would protect the blood purity of the German people, and he would help the rest of humanity rise up. To do that, he appointed his crony Heinrich Himmler to construct a system that would first work undesirables to death and then later outright exterminate them. He would start with the Jews and the Gypsies, but he would later expand it to include homosexuals, Polish people, and others. A secondary goal was to clean out lands that they had conquered so that German people could come occupy them. They started with the construction of work camps where the inmates were literally worked to death, and then after experimentation, they created camps like Auschwitz and Birkenau, where they systematically gassed and killed anyone who wouldn't fit into the new order. It's important to note that while, of course, many Darwinians and even more than a few followers of Nietzsche were horrified by this, it is completely consistent with the logic of naturalistic Darwinian thought. If humans are just animals, if they have no inherent value in and of themselves, why not kill the bad ones so the good ones can grow stronger? Just like you do with a herd of cows. If life is all about survival of the fittest, if that is your only absolute, why shouldn't the weak be killed off to make way for the strong? Why should you have charity at all? If there is no objective, bigger meaning to right and wrong than your own opinion or what your culture says, in what way can we call the Holocaust evil? Our culture says it was evil. The Nazi culture, which according to this view is as good as ours, said that it wasn't. In fact, Hitler was already designing a massive memorial to himself, and, had they won the war, doubtless the Germans would have given it to him. What makes our opinions better than his if there is no objective standard? And I hope you can understand what I'm getting at here, and I also hope that you're horrified by it. At least the Nazis were stopped. Not so with Comrade Stalin in Russia or Chairman Mao in China. As for Marx, communism emerged triumphant in Russia and China by the early to mid-20th century. Built on the atheistic ideal that all humans are animals, and also that some animals are more equal than others, both societies set about a series of purges and programs designed to create a perfect communist utopia by killing anyone who did not fit into their particular view of society. They were brutally effective, too. Stalin is now thought to have deliberately murdered somewhere between 9 and 23 million people of his own. He was only eclipsed in world history by Mao, who is believed to have murdered somewhere between 40 and 80 million people. We're shocked by those numbers, but perhaps that's because we see clearly that there is good and evil in the world. If you believe that humans make their own truth and that survival of the fittest is the only absolute, then perhaps what's only surprising is that the numbers weren't higher. In the end, this colossal waste of life accomplished nothing. Ideal Marxism is simply incompatible with human nature. As a result, it took almost 50 years, but the Soviet Union would crumble under its own weight. Today, China is still communist in name, but it has only survived by integrating significant capitalist reforms to prop up their economy. One would think that the main lesson you could take from the 20th century would be that communism doesn't work. Sadly, blind faith springs eternal, and there are many people out there right now who are actively pushing for communist reforms, even in the United States. Which brings us to One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. This is a book written by Nobel laureate Alexander Solzhenitsyn and published in 1962. It recounts one full day in the life of an innocent Russian man who was falsely accused of being a spy in one of Stalin's purges and shipped off to a freezing prison camp called a Gulag. We follow Ivan from the time he wakes up through one awful experience after another until he finally lays his weary head down at the end of the day. The book may seem rather plain in an awful, grinding sort of way. The reason it's significant is that it was the first example of Stalin's crimes against humanity that was actually published in the Soviet Union itself. To try this while Stalin was alive, he died in 1953, would have resulted in instant death. It's a testimony to how long Stalin's shadow was that it was another 10 years before anyone was successful. Both Stalin and Mao were remarkably effective in keeping the worst of their crimes secret. Many, even in their own countries, didn't know the full depth of what was happening, and outside, in places like the United States, news was even sketchier. What did leak out, communist operatives and sympathizers actively worked to discredit, and the communists would actually take Westerners on specially guided tours to see actors and actresses living model lives pretending to be well-fed and happy. So that it was actually many years before the true depth of Stalin and Mao's depravity was known. This is one reason why communism remained so popular in the West, particularly on the political left and in the university systems. They often didn't know the truth about things, and when they heard it, they simply wrote it off as propaganda, which in itself offers another important lesson for us. So, Solzhenitsyn's book represents not only a truthful tale of a hard and brutal time, but the first step in a campaign that would bring much evil to light, and in the end, it helped overturn one of the most repressive systems of government the world has seen in recent years. In the words of Ukrainian journalist Vitaly Korotych, the Soviet Union was destroyed by information, and this wave started from Solzhenitsyn's One Day. Back in Europe and America, though, the effects of the Great Disappointments began to take hold in dangerous ways. Interestingly, it wasn't because of economic hardship this time. In 1946, the U.S. instituted the Marshall Plan, named for General George C. Marshall, which rapidly rebuilt Europe, West Germany, and Japan using American money and industry. In an amazingly short amount of time, things turned around. By the 1980s, in fact, Japan and West Germany had grown so economically powerful that they were challenging even the U.S. itself for economic dominance. In the U.S., the transition to post-war affluence and boom was almost instantaneous. Factories that were making fighters, bombers, and tanks quickly refitted to make cars and refrigerators. This generated millions of new, good-paying jobs and drove prices down on many things that Americans needed and wanted. The baby boom generation was born, and the good times began to roll again for the U.S. All of this abundance, security, and new technologies contributed to a philosophical change that was already happening. As we said, this generation was sick of failed promises of the Enlightenment, Romantics, and the Progressives. Those three groups had led the way in what was called the modern period. Now, today we often use the word modern to simply mean whatever is most recent. That's a modern idea, that's a modern piece of technology, whatever. But it actually referred philosophically to this secular worldview of humans in the center of the universe doing all the things that God used to do, with God out of the picture. Now, when that was new, people used to describe those ideas or those technologies, all the new thinking and creativity, as modern, which is where we get the connection from. But eventually, modernism itself got old too. After the World Wars, people rejected modernism with its promises and its certainty and its science supreme. In its place, philosophers and culture makers put forward what came to be called postmodernism. That might sound strange if you still think modern just means recent, but if you remember that it was a worldview, it makes sense. You can move on to something that is postmodern in that way. Postmodernism is a very diverse movement that touched a lot of different people in very different ways, and so it can be very, very hard to explain. It started in literature, and it spread outward from there until today it has infected virtually every part of American life. It's even a common feature of many churches these days, sadly. If it's possible to boil everything down, the closest thing to a central premise that postmodernism has is a complete rejection of even the idea of truth. There is no such thing as truth. There is no such thing as right and wrong or good and evil. And everything is an opinion because there is no truth outside of ourselves, outside of individual human people. Truth is relative to each individual, and one person's truth has no hold over another person. How many times have you heard someone say some nonsense like, well, that's your truth, or live your truth and let me live mine? That is straight up postmodern relativism. This is strikingly different from what came before. Previously, people believed in objective truth. This means truth, right and wrong, good and evil, are defined by an object outside yourself. So if you don't know what's true, you just look at the object to find out. To a Christian, for example, if you ask what's the truth, they are going to refer you to the Bible and to science. Is murder wrong? Thou shalt not commit murder. Done. Modernists and progressives would have looked to science. Is the sun a star? Yes. Done. But postmodernism believes in a subjective view of truth that relates to the subject asking the question. So, when Obi-Wan lies to Luke about his father dying, Obi-Wan says it isn't a lie because it just depends upon your point of view. So there's no hard or fast answer. It all gets down to the opinion of the person doing the thinking. And things can change based on how that person happens to feel. Now we know there are things in life that are preference-based. Do you like chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream? There's no objective truth to that. But postmodernism doesn't stop there. It reduces everything to a preference. Is murder wrong? Well, for some people it is, but maybe for others it isn't. Is the sun a star? Well, that depends on what you mean by star. Some versions of postmodernism have gone so far as to deny the existence of science itself. Much of the LGBTQIA+ movement is based on this. There is no meaning to male or female, so I define truth myself, and I create the gender identity I want, no matter what the biological facts might happen to be. It quickly degenerates into straight nonsense. Linguists write books and give speeches about how language communicates nothing. A person will look at you with a straight face and say, there absolutely are no absolutes. Well, if there are no absolutes, how can you say that absolutely? Very often, it's simply a form of intellectual suicide. But it has very dangerous implications that are still playing out in culture right in front of us. For example, if there's no such thing as evil, if evil is just an opinion and another person's opinion is as good as mine, then how do I call the Holocaust evil? How do I call shooting up a school evil? How does that have any meaning at all? Why should I be honest with you if there's no such thing as a lie? How is it a lie when I tell you something dishonestly? It's not, in my point of view. Since stealing isn't wrong, quote unquote, what's to stop me from creatively redistributing your property to me? And to come full circle, if the Holocaust isn't wrong, what's to stop a government from doing it again in the name of the so-called greater good? It's a big mess, and it's no practical way to run a fair civilization. Enter Francis Schaeffer. Schaeffer and his wife Edith were Protestant missionaries serving in Switzerland, and they established a retreat center called L'Abri, which means the shelter. Starting with his daughter's college friends, Schaeffer and his wife ministered to hundreds and later thousands of people struggling with the legacy of modernism and slipping into postmodernism. He later wrote a number of important books, including How Should We Then Live, and he toured giving talks and lectures. As you start in on Schaeffer, remember that he is what you might call a prophet to his times. What he has to say is brilliant and really in many ways prophetic. He sees what's happening around us in some ways better than many contemporary Christians. Schaeffer understood the tides of philosophy that we've been talking about, and he knew which way the winds were blowing. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, he called out trends and warned Christians about consequences to postmodernism that would only become clear and undeniable 40 years later. He specifically predicted the insanity that we see around us today. At the same time, Schaeffer believed strongly that it is the Christian's role to speak directly to the generation around them. In his case, that was the hippie culture. So even though his ideas are really forward-thinking, they are couched in language and examples that today often seem old and dated. As you read, or worse, watch some of the movies, please keep that in mind. Look at the ideas, not necessarily the execution. The point of Schaeffer's book is simple. Given what we see in the world around us as Christians, how should we then live? What does it look like to be a Christian in such crazy and perilous times? His answer is simple, profound, biblical, and yet incredibly difficult. For too long, Christians have tended to look at Christ as something they add on to an already full life. Being a Christian is something that you do extra on Sundays in addition to everything else. Schaeffer says that Christ himself would call that out as false. We are to seek what Schaeffer describes as the lordship of Christ over the totality of life, and in doing so we should reject the lies of postmodern subjectivism and strive for what he calls true truth. This is truth that has actual value and meaning, grounded in God, and therefore outside of ourselves. Christ isn't something extra that we do. He is the foundation upon which we build, and we see everything, the entire world, through his eyes. He is the standard by which we judge everything in the universe. Perhaps another way of putting it evokes the title of a different book, The God Who Is There. What makes Christianity different from other religions is simply this: it is real and true. God exists and is a real person exactly as the Bible describes him. Christ is a real person who actually touched the same earth that you are right now. But very often we forget that. We pretend that God isn't there, or that he isn't real, or that he isn't listening. How differently would you live your life if you actually and truly and deeply believed that he is there and that he is not silent? That he sees and knows everything that you think and do, and is ready to help you and speak to you in the midst of it all. Our final readings on the epistles of Jude and Peter are actually cut from a very similar cloth. Just like Schaeffer, they are focused on real people, people who knew Christ personally, learning to navigate a very difficult and unbelieving world, just like we are. As such, they are an excellent note on which to end our journey. And with that, I thank you for spending your time with me. I hope that we've all grown a little closer to Christ and wiser about living our lives. Godspeed.